All right, so in today's A Block, we're going to be talking about NYCHA. So we thought we'd bring you up to speed a little bit and look at New York City's housing authority. If I can get in there. Our first slide, NYCHA by the numbers. NYCHA, of course, is the largest public housing authority in all of North America. There's some 177,000 plus apartments spread over 328 developments and 2,547 residential buildings containing about 3,300 elevators. That's just elevators alone. Digging a little bit deeper, there are 175,000 plus families and 403,000 plus authorized residents who currently reside in NYCHA, and about 11,398 employees who keep the system running. Looking some more at the numbers, there are 3,544 Section 8 households residing in former state and city-funded developments. And if it was its own city, get this, NYCHA would rank 31st in population size. Very interesting stuff. And it represents about 8.1% of the city's rental apartments and 4% plus of all of the population of the entire city. So that is NYCHA by the numbers. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about the man who we're going to meet in a second. City Council member Ritchie Torres grew up in Throgs Neck in a building run by NYCHA. He attended H.H. Lehman High School, whose facility is about 79% Black and Latino, and was elected to office in November of 2013 to represent the 15th council district in the Bronx. So a little bit more, he's the only LGBTQ Black-Latino elected in the entire state of New York, which is an accomplishment, and also the chairman of the Committee on Public Housing, and he's known for his legislative reforms from NYCHA operations. So that's a little bit about the man, as well as the New York City Housing Authority. And I can tell you that in 2014, when Ritchie Torres began his career as an elected official, he was the youngest member of the New York City Council. 2 years later, yeah, he's gained 2 years in age, he was also the only freshman member to hold a leadership position. That would be Deputy Majority Leader. And he chairs the Committee on Public Housing. He's also serving on the Land Use and Public Safety Committees, as well as the Housing and Buildings Committee, all things of vital importance to Brooklynites. So I'm happy to welcome New York City Council member Ritchie Torres to BK Live. That's a lot.
It's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. You're still the youngest.
I'm still the youngest, although fast aging. So politics takes a toll.
Aren't we all?
Even though I'm a proud son of the Bronx,
yeah,
I have tremendous love for Brooklyn.
You've crossed the bridge more than once.
I have, and you know, Brooklyn has the highest concentration of public housing.
It's true.
Public housing is the central cause of my life. And some of my best friends, like Councilmember NYCHA, Councilmember Varionoso are from Brooklyn.
They are.
Councilmember Williams, Councilmember Lander.
They've all been in that seat. So
I consider myself an honorary member of the Brooklyn delegation.
All right, we're not upset about that. So welcome again. We're happy to have you in the seat that they all sat in. So just, you mentioned earlier that Brooklyn does have the highest concentration of NYCHA housing here. What other sort of issues parallel between your district in the Bronx and Brooklyn?
Well, I think the thread that binds us together, those two boroughs, is public housing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, public housing, you have about 400,000 authorized residents.
Right.
You might have as many as 200,000 unauthorized residents, but that could be a conservative estimate.
Yeah.
And then you have an additional 200,000 New Yorkers who depend on the New York City Housing Authority for Section 8. So among those three categories, NYCHA houses a population of about 1 million residents. It's a singular phenomenon in American history, right? There's no institution in our country that houses people on the scale that the New York City Housing Authority does. So
why aren't you getting the funding from the top down at the federal level that you need? We heard that there's something like a $96 million gap in funding, that projections into the year, 2015 was it? We're looking at that by 2025, it could jump to something like $400 million. Now, you won't be in office then.
And you're referring to the operating deficit.
Right.
So NYCHA has been so starved of resources from the federal government that it has come to accumulate about $17 billion worth of capital needs. So in order to replace all the systems and all the structures, all the roofs and all the bricks, all the elevators and all the boilers that need to be replaced, you would need to invest $17 billion in New York City public housing. So there's a $17 billion gap between where public housing should be and where public housing currently is, the status quo. And that's as a result largely of federal underfunding.
So $17 billion is a number that many of us could hardly wrap our minds around. But what does that mean in terms of, I'm walking a few blocks away from here at the Ingersoll houses. How does that $17 million affect the daily life of a person who woke up this morning as a NYCHA resident?
So it means that the conditions in public housing are deteriorating rapidly, because not only do you have underfunding at every level of government, the federal, city, and state, but the perfect storm of disinvestment from public housing is coming at a time when most of the buildings are either at or approaching the age of 60. Right? These are buildings that need to be upgraded. And so if there's no funding for roofs or bricks, you will have tenants living in apartments infested with mold, with leaks. And you can paint over the problem, you can spray over the problem, but you cannot address the root causes of constant leakage and constant mold in apartments without replacing or repairing the bricks and the roofs.
So you are heading this committee, and there was some news a few months ago when the city council got a pay bump.
Yeah.
And by now, like, your salary is 20 times the median of your district. So how do you still relate to people and stay grounded in a sense to do that work when, by the numbers, you're so far removed from the plight of the folks who are waking up in mold-infested places in need of repair?
Yeah, so look, I never forget where I came from. You know, my mother and my twin brother continue living in public housing. And I tour public housing every single week, and I see firsthand the conditions in which tenants are struggling with in their own apartments. And before I became a council member, I was making about 20 grand a year. So,
well, that's the median income of the area.
Of my district. Yeah. So I am not too far removed from the everyday struggles that my constituents face.
So who else on the council? Do you know of any of your colleagues who have the same sort of personal connection or can really say that they've walked that walk? I'm trying to find out who's on your coalition, who's standing with Ritchie when he's saying this is the real life of people living in NYCHA now.
I think there's broad support for public housing within the city council, but very few of us are actually products of public housing. Yeah. I think there might be 2 or 3 members, but I have put it at the center of my political career. You know, for me, there are many people like my mother. You know, she raised 3 children, my brother, my sister, and me, living in public housing, earning minimum wage, and we would have been homeless but for public housing. You know, the beauty of living in public housing is that it makes your income, it makes your rent 30% of your income. Right. So even if you lose income, even if you lose your job because of circumstances beyond your control,
levels up.
It does not mean the loss of your apartment. It does not mean the loss of your livelihood. It does not mean that you go into a shelter and your life will never be the same again. And so NYCHA gave me a level of stability that I would have never known without public housing. And that's why I want to spend the rest of my political career defending and preserving public housing so that hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers can have the same fighting chance at a decent life that I had growing up.
Well, you famously said during your election, during the campaigning, that there was members of the sort of class that you were in trying to get the job. There was, what, 5 other people who were running for
Originally 9, and then it whittled down to 5.
Okay,
and I ran against a candidate who had the same exact name as the outgoing council member. So the outgoing council member was Joel Rivera.
Right.
My opponent was named Joel Rivera. And he was leading constituents to believe that he was the council member. Yeah. So I famously accused him of political identity theft and referred to him as the fake Joel Rivera.
But there was also
there's never a dull moment in Bronx politics.
Well, welcome to Brooklyn too. Yeah. There's a line where you said that someone in the race doesn't feel like poor people should be representing people in the city council. Like, this is not a position for someone.
I was attacked by my opponents for living in low-income housing. I said, how could it be that a councilmanic, that was not a Freudian slip, that a councilmanic candidate is living in low-income housing? And I said, the answer is simple. I was low income. I made 20 grand a year, and I qualified for low-income housing. So the suggestion was that you should only have a certain level of net worth. I mean, that's the Donald Trump theory of politics. I'm not clear that we should be buying into it. So.
Well, you said presidential and you invoked Trump. I know that you are keeping your eye on presidential politics this year. I just wanted to find out, we had in Brooklyn, Hillary and Bernie were here for a debate a few blocks away from here that seemed to be woefully absent of concerns of urban areas. Absolutely. There was no talk of NYCHA. There was no talk of infrastructure and needs that most of the Americans living in metropolitan areas care about. How are you getting into the ear of those who would run this country to make sure that city have their needs fulfilled?
So I had concerns that there were virtually no discussion of urban issues, the affordability crisis in the presidential race. So I partnered with Brad Lander, with the Community Service Society, the Legal Aid Society, Community Voices Heard, a host of organizations, to send out a letter to the presidential candidates, challenging them to tour public housing and to develop an affordable housing platform and speak more broadly about urban issues. And originally, none of the candidates took me up on my offer.
Then who came through?
But Lawrence O'Donnell from MSNBC News came to my district, a public housing development in Twin Parks West, and he did a segment on public housing known as the Hidden City, because NYCHA is large enough to be a city unto itself.
31st in the nation.
And the irony of public housing is that even though it's geographically everywhere, it's invisible to the federal government, including the presidential candidates. And that segment had a real impact in shining a harsh spotlight on how the poorest New Yorkers live in public housing. And it led Hillary Clinton to visit a public housing development in East Harlem the following Friday. Bernie Sanders went to Brownsville, Brooklyn, which has the largest concentration of public housing in North America.
That's right.
And then he went to Twin Parks West in the Bronx, and then Bill Clinton went to Jefferson Houses. And so we had a real impact in bringing public housing into the presidential conversation about inequality. Because what I said to the presidential candidates is that you cannot campaign against inequality from the ivory tower. You have to actually go where poor people live. You have to actually go to public housing and see the conditions firsthand, see the lack of access to programming and opportunity among our youth.
Well, public housing is once again in the headlines after yesterday's sort of New York PD record-breaking gang arrest and a high concentration of folks from the Bronx. I think there were some 87 arrests.
We had like 700 law enforcement officials and 120. It was the largest takedown in the history in American history. 87
specifically came from housing developments in the Bronx. So I wondered, we talked about the environmental concerns and some of the mold and building infrastructure problems, but what other kind of issues on the human scale are folks facing? We're finding about sort of gang turf war that's been brought to the forefront right now. Is that safety concern something that's in the front of your mind as well as you work for budgets and improved situations?
All of it is interconnected. I think the urban poor, not only in New York City, but elsewhere in the country, has been systematically abandoned by every level of government, but particularly the federal government. And when you have neighborhoods that have no access to social services, to employment, when you have the poor outcomes in public health, when you have dilapidated housing, when you have over-policing, what you're going to have is a generation of young people who are so alienated from social and civic life that their only family is essentially a gang.
None of it's happening in a vacuum.
None of it is happening. There's a social context that explains it.
So let's broaden up a little bit. For the last 4 weeks, we've had a hell of a time booking anyone from the New York City Council because everyone's doing the budget dance.
Yes, it has.
You're having the meetings with the man, you're checking what's happening in the district. So tell us about the budget process from a council eye view, especially for someone who heads a committee as important as yours. You're fighting for the entire NYCHA, but also for your constituents.
So it begins with the mayor in January introducing a preliminary budget.
Right.
The city council then comes out with a response after holding a series of hearings. The mayor then issues the executive budget, and then we hold a series of hearings which result in a response from the city council. And then after the response, we negotiate with the mayor about some of the, look, most of the budget is predetermined.
Well, right? $82 billion, just tell us what he got wrong.
So most of the budget is predetermined, right? It's personnel cost, it's the cost of operating city agencies, which are consistent from year to year.
Right.
But it's the strategic priorities that we're debating. So last year, the main priority was securing an increase in the headcount of the NYPD, right? We were able to expand the headcount of the NYPD by 1,300 officers at a cost of about $170 million. You know, I co-chair the Black-Latino and Asian Caucus.
Yeah, how do you feel about that?
It's an unwieldy caucus with 25 principals, 25 egos.
Caucus. How do you feel about the way that they added money for headcount for police? And where did he get it wrong this year? Where would you put the money?
Look, the headcount is part of a broader vision of community policing.
Yeah.
Whether it will unfold as envisioned remains to be seen. What I wish were the case is that I wish if we were going to increase the headcount by 1,300 officers, I wish there had been comparable investments in youth employment and social services.
Is NYCHA still paying separately for
No, NYCHA has been exempt and will remain exempt from the NYPD payments. But if we're going to increase the amount of policing in low-income communities, we should make commensurate investments in youth employment, in programming. You know, for us to allocate most of our resources to policing sends the wrong message. Even though policing, again, it's a critical element of preserving quality of life and well-being in a neighborhood, but we need to invest in our young people.
So you pioneered participatory budgeting in your part of the Bronx. So I wondered, on that angle, what would you like to see in the city council if you got to allocate more of that money citywide instead of helping people in your district decide how they'll spend $1 million?
As far as a citywide priority?
Yeah, like if the participatory budgeting there and the mayor had to take a back seat to the council, where would you be leading the charge?
Well, if there were participatory budgeting, it would be driven by the people. But what I suspect is my priority is universal youth employment.
Okay.
Is that every young person who wants to get a job should have the ability to obtain one.
Disconnected youth.
Yeah, so we should create enough. So there are about 175,000 disconnected young people in New York City. Young people who don't go to school, who don't go to work, whose only existence is essentially life on the streets.
Right.
And we should have enough slots to employ those young people.
Well,
we have an $80 billion budget.
Yeah.
It's
82.
time that we create more room for the most disenfranchised and disadvantaged voices in the life of our city.
Or we can just wait and sweep them up in a gang sweep like we did yesterday.
We have a choice to make, right? Either if we can either invest in them now, or we could pay the cost of mass incarceration in the future. And I'd rather invest in our young people today.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you for joining us. This
is
an enlightening conversation. You should come back to Brooklyn whenever you like.
As long as I'm granted a visa, we'll come.
I'll stamp it on your way out. Thanks for being here, Ritchie
Of course.
Torres.